I'm a scholar of international politics and security, and we're all products of our own personal biographies to some extent. So I am, despite my relative youth, I'm actually the child of Holocaust survivors who traveled, whose childhoods were spent moving from one part of Europe to another part of Europe, and then as immigrants to Canada and the United States. And so, and we had cousins, of course, and family that had survived the war all over the world. And so it was quite natural that I would be drawn to the study of politics. This was actually, in a way, much to my parents' chagrin. They would have been much happier were I a lawyer. Originally, had I been a chemist, but you know, they're okay with what has transpired. That's sort of the larger intellectual background. What's really been occupying me as my interests have developed over the course of the last decade has been the role of political rhetoric. The study of international politics has long been dominated by materialist ways of thinking about politics. That is, that either a sense that states were basically like billiard balls, that they were struck by forces, they were going to respond in predictable ways, and it didn't really matter whether they were stripes or solids. The other metaphor that's often used is that states are like people in a house on fire. That if the house is on fire, what do? Of course, they all rush for the exits. And their ideology doesn't really matter, and so on. And so that perspective, known as by the rather grand self-declared title of realism, that perspective is one that I've never found very satisfying. Because it imagines international politics as a realm of compulsion. But in fact, the real world of international politics is one of choice. It matters if you're a stripe or a solid. And it matters, it seems to me. The house is not all that often truly on fire. And in fact, you often have choices. Maybe it's a little brush fire. Maybe it's merely overheated. Maybe it's actually at that moment perfectly comfortable. Maybe you wish it to be a little warmer. The other perspective has taken domestic politics seriously, but largely attributes it to states' behavior and foreign policy to things like democratic politics, and hasn't been centrally concerned with what I take to be one of the core questions of human existence. That is, how do we go about making meaning? The human experience is about the quest for meaning. And when human beings look out on the world, and as I did, going back to my youth and trying to, as when I first started reading the New York Times, trying to make sense of that world, it's about the quest for meaning. And of course, people make meaning in vastly different ways, and the ways which we make meaning are mediated by language. And that's how I got really interested in questions of rhetoric and narrative and its relationship to foreign policy. My first major book, which was based on my dissertation, was about military service and the politics of citizenship. And the idea that we owe our veterans something, that those who have sacrificed on the field of battle for the nation, that they in fact are owed something by the political community, that is very much a rhetorical trope. A widely shared way of speaking about politics that veterans or population groups that have volunteered or been willing to serve have long taken advantage of. And as I began reflecting on that project and extending that project, this led me to the book that is being published this month with Cambridge University Press, entitled Narrative in the Making of U.S. National Security. So it's kind of this intellectual trajectory. But there is really, like so much of the work I and so many other scholars of international affairs do, there is also a way in which we are very much driven by the politics of the present, or if you will, the very recent past. Just as I was finishing my dissertation, in fact, my very last year, when I remember just a couple months before I came here to interview at the University of Minnesota, 9/11 struck. And the world that in which I began teaching and then I began to have to make sense of for my students was a world that was structured by the war on terror, structured by a way of making sense of what had transpired on 9/11 that didn't strike me at the time as at all obvious. And I imagine to many of you, either at the time or in retrospect, won't strike you as at all obvious. The politics of U.S. national security after 9/11 were structured by a dominant narrative that came to understand what had transpired on 9/11 and our role as a nation in the world in very peculiar in particular ways. And by peculiar I don't mean strange, though they might have been strange. I mean peculiar in the sense that it was unique and didn't have to be that way. And so my book tries to make sense not just of the politics of after 9/11, of the way in which 9/11 shaped U.S. politics for the next decade, but the larger dynamic of which that post 9/11 period was a part. That is, how is it that certain narratives have come to be dominant in the United States and around the world, and how is it that those dominant narratives shape the kind of politics that we pursue, shape our debates over national security, and then in turn, how is it that those dominant narratives come to be undone, so that they are no longer dominant, and we have room for a broader debate about national security. This, to my mind, has really important implications for the capacity of oppositions to challenge those dominant narratives, for a kind of a pragmatic critical politics. That is, a world in which we don't approve of the kinds of policies that our government has pursued, but we have to be realistic and be aware of the capacities and the opportunities for opposition and for resistance to those policies. And this is not just an American phenomenon, right? When we can think of countless dominant narratives, those we might approve of and those we might not approve of, from the Gaullist notion that France, of the restoration of French grandeur, to the Nazi quest for living space, to Israelis' contention that they have no partner for peace in the Middle East, or specifically amongst the Palestinians. These are all dominant narratives that, at least for a time, deeply shaped their nation's politics. And so my work has been trying to understand how is it that those narratives became dominant, and how did those dominant narratives come to collapse. And I've done so through the prism of the United States, exploring a range of episodes with different degrees of rigor and systematicity over U.S. politics from the 1930s through the 2000s.
After 9/11, George Bush could have said, a great crime has been committed on American soil, and we will use all of the instruments of national and international police work to pursue the criminals and bring them to justice. Had he said that, he might have disappeared from the world stage as a laughingstock, or U.S. policy might have been redirected in some important way. When you spoke about narratives being peculiar in the sense they could have been otherwise, how do you make sense of what would have been another possible narrative at a particular point in time? For example, is the narrative a very large crime was committed in New York City and we must send the police to find the criminals and arrest them? Was that in the sense you understand it, a possible narrative?
Fantastic question. So let's take a step back and talk about what a narrative means. There are any number of ways of conceptualizing narratives. There have been sort of debates among literary theorists about what precisely narratives are, how many components they have, whether in fact we have a kind of a stock set of narratives so that every narrative known to man in fact fits into one of these categories. Folklorists have been famous, especially Russian structuralists, for numbers of set narratives. That's not my way of thinking about narrative, but if many of you took a course on literary theory, this should sound pretty familiar. I think about narrative as basically as a kind of a drama. The literary theorist Kenneth Burke spoke of a dramatic pentat. He said there were 5 basic characteristics. And those don't always fit so well into the way that I'm thinking about narratives. I'm interested in particular in public narratives of national security. But there's a basic element to narratives about who are the agents of action, what kind of acts have they committed, what have they done, what is their purpose, what motivates them, and with what consequences, and what is the larger scene or setting in which they're operating. Those are the key components. And if we alter any one of those components, we really end up telling a very different kind of story. Now, the story that Peter just shared with you, that is a story, very common alternative frame for 9/11, as a story of crime rather than as a story of war, actually, to my mind, is not actually the fundamentally different narrative of 9/11. I think that that is actually a debate within a dominant narrative. And so that I think that Peter's question actually really nicely points out another aspect, which is what is it that dominant narratives do? Dominant narratives, in my conception, don't shut down political debate. If they did, but since politics is ubiquitous and politics is always going on, then clearly we never have dominant narratives. But of course we do have dominant narratives. They don't shut down our political debates. They structure our political debates. The frame of 9/11 as crime was the other acceptable stance within American politics after 9/11. There was a stance that was widely derided as not acceptable, as beyond the pale, as illegitimate, because it wasn't sustainable within the dominant narrative. And that was the notion that that what transpired at 9/11 was not an attack on who we are, but rather a response to what we have done. The notion that what took place on 9/11 was a crime rather than war did not contest in and of itself that the acts perpetrated on 9/11 were deeply evil, right? That is to say, apolitical, motivated by, not motivated by a political agenda. It didn't contest that the adversary after 9/11 was not what we would later call Al-Qaeda and like-minded affiliates, but rather terror, right? Which is really a tactic, of course. Terror is as old as human beings waging violence against each other, which is as old as humanity. The notion that what transpired on 9/11 was a crime did not challenge the idea that 9/11 was a rupture in time, that it marked a fundamental transformation in world history, which many contested, right? That many saw, in fact, what had transpired. Certainly many saw 9/11 as simply a blip in historical time. That was not part of the dominant narrative of 9/11. And finally, one might have seen what transpired, one might have questioned whether, in fact, terror was an existential threat on a par with the Soviet Union, which was the implication of George Bush's rhetoric, and also, for the first 2 years of his administration, I would say Barack Obama's rhetoric, if you read it quite carefully. In fact, he says it quite explicitly in his inaugural address. Barack Obama, the clearest indication that the war on terror, to which Peter alluded, is not the underlying fundamental narrative, is that Barack Obama avoided that what was seen by them to be a poison slogan, but gave voice to all of those other features of the narrative that I just alluded to. That is, that 9/11 was a critical transformative moment. That the adversary was terror or terrorists or violent extremists, rather than Al-Qaeda and like-minded affiliates. That in fact, that terrorism was not an existential threat, but was simply an important threat on a par or amongst many others. All of this comes to pass only once we get to the 2010, 2011, the second, third years of the Obama administration. Then the narrative begins to shift. Peter's raised a very important question about how do we understand, how do we come to terms with counterfactuals? Every causal argument that we would make has implicit in it a counterfactual. If I will tell you that X causes Y, by implication I'm telling you that not X means not Y. Or that if X had been Z, then the outcome might well not have been Y. And this is a really deep question of philosophy. We have a couple of guidelines for how we construct useful counterfactuals. The first is that we can't alter things that are really fundamental. That is sort of the minimal rewrite rule. So the old sort of historical questions about, well, what if Germany had won World War I? that really would clearly violate a minimal rewrite rule. Or, as the great historian of the Civil War, Robert Fogel, used to ask, what if there had been railroads at the time of the Civil War? But of course, that would have involved a whole lot of other major technological changes that would have affected the way the war could have been done. So I'm interested in a much more narrow counterfactual that I think is sustainable, right? Which is, what if either George W. Bush or let's say there hadn't been a few more hanging chads, and Al Gore had been in office? What then would have transpired, and what would have been sustainable within the American body politic? And so we can ask ourselves, that really depends upon the kinds of theories that you have about what drives responses to particular kinds of narratives, about the role of what matters. Does it matter how you speak? Does it matter who's doing the speaking, whether we're dealing with a Democrat or a Republican? Does it matter if the individual simply occupies an authoritative role or not? Does it matter the nature of the larger political context and the discursive moment? And that would help you understand what is sustainable at that very time. So, for instance, I think that there are good psychological and political reasons to think that the idea that, on the one hand, you might say there are good political psychological reasons that that it's because they hate us, they've attacked us not because of who we are, but because of what we have done, that is, support for Israel, or support for autocratic Arab regimes, or support for globalization, whatever your account might be, and these are highly contested in and of themselves. There are good psychological reasons to think that kind of self-flagellatory rhetoric might well not have transpired or been particularly sustainable in the wake of a terrorist attack. And yet there are also good psychological reasons to think that might have been particularly sustainable in the wake of a shocking terrorist attack, that in which Americans might well be open to a new way of narrating themselves. And so it's really dependent on the kinds of theories that you would hold about psychology and politics, and we'd have to get into the particular detail. Then it gets very, very fine-grained in order to ascertain what was sustainable in any particular political context, which we can delve more into the post-9/11 context if you would like.
Well, it seems like the payoff of this kind of reflection might be an argument, perhaps of use to actors at a particular point in history, that a particular alternative to the emerging narrative is sustainable. In other words, if one could give an argument, say you're around the table with Barack Obama, and he's trying to sell a rather painful response to climate change, and given the dominant narrative, it's not going very well. I mean, what one might want to do is to make an argument that, given what one knows about narratives, an alternative is sustainable. An alternative will fly if presented forcefully and eloquently and in various ways. Are you at a point in your work where you can make that kind of argument?
So I would point to a configuration or a conjuncture of three factors that shape how it is that certain narratives become dominant. And then, and I'm all, by the way, dealing only with the national security domain, so I don't want to speak particularly to climate change and so on, right? We have to focus on, the reason it matters so much, as you'll see in a moment, is that this is really a function of three factors. It's a function of moment, it's a function of mode, and it's a function of the speaker. So speakers are differentially empowered with different degrees of authority. And this is why the policy domain is crucial. National security isn't quite the same thing as climate change that touches on such issues as economics, of course, and basic basic ways in which we approach our lives. So while Peter's point is very well taken, question is very well taken, that's not a domain that I've particularly studied. But we certainly know that there are certain kinds of authoritative speakers in the American context, and we might well imagine that these authoritative speakers look different cross-nationally, so that prime ministers in a Westminster-type system are empowered differently in the national security domain from presidents, who in the American context, who are quite unique in this regard. So we have authoritative speakers, particularly what some would call securitizing speakers, who, when the dominant narrative has broken down, people demand and are eager for someone to make sense of confusing events for them. And those moments, like a post-9/11 moment, or really I would even say a post-Cold War moment, when the world became very hard to narrate, people were very eager for a narrative about the world. And so it's this mix, and then you have to supply it in the right way, which isn't just about eloquence, because in fact lots of political speakers are eloquent, though to see the recent political debates, not all of them are particularly eloquent. It's about telling a story. Barack Obama, for all of the ways in which on the campaign trail, he told a remarkable personal narrative, and a remarkable narrative about American politics, has not done so, and has been strangely reluctant to do so when it comes to his own policy initiatives. And he himself recognized, there's a wonderful interview that he gave at the end of his first term, in which he said, he was asked about something along the lines of, what are the biggest mistakes that you've made? And Obama said, my biggest mistake was thinking that it was the arguments, the best arguments that are going to win, he said. I didn't appreciate how much people need a story to make sense of it all for them. Well, I would posit to you that in the next 4 years, it is something about Barack Obama's natural character, something about his academic orientation, his constitutional law background, I'm not sure what it is, but that he continues to gravitate back to wonkish arguments, to policy arguments that have failed to really make sense of it all for people. You've got to offer that kind of narrative. He hasn't done so. So it's the mode in which you speak, that is to say a storytelling mode, combined with the right time, because if the timing isn't right, you can be up for all the storytelling you want and can be the most talented speaker in the world, and you're not going to win. Nobody was a better speaker and told more stories, more eloquently than Ronald Reagan. And yet Ronald Reagan's greatest frustration as president was that he could not persuade the American people that what was going on in Nicaragua, the Contra rebellion against the Sandinista government, was a security problem for the United States of the highest order. That the Sandinistas were, as he used to put it, a Marxist-Leninist outpost for fomenting revolution in our backyard, as he often referred to Latin America. Reagan told that story, and he told it in a storytelling mode. So we have an authoritative speaker in a storytelling mode, but it's got to be in the right moment. And of course, that was not a moment in which multiple stories were swirling about. That was a moment in which the Cold War was alive and well. So it's the opportunity, the structural opportunity in which things have broken open, combined with authoritative speakers seizing that opportunity. And so then you will of course ask yourself, what leads it to break open? Now, our usual accounts of this say that what leads these things to break open is really sort of massive policy failures. That it's in the context of the Great Depression that traditional ways of thinking about organizing economies, they break apart. That it's the wake of massive policy failures, arguably like Vietnam, right, which led to the deaths of over 50,000 Americans and hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese, that really the Cold War consensus began to break apart. And so the second half of my book explores this in the context of the national security domain. As I began to think about this more and more, I realized that we had this story completely backwards, because we thought of this as if it were an epiphany, as if we suddenly realized that, my policy has failed. Therefore, in that moment, like I suddenly jump up and say, Eureka, there's got to be a new way of thinking about the world. It's deeply apolitical. And in fact, I argue that because of the politics of national security, in the national security domain, that in fact these failures are very often protracted. Military campaigns, these failures only reveal themselves over time. And of course the politics of national security means that you're going to, often revolves around trying to make sense of these battlefield failures. And as opponents of the administration that owns the campaign, as opponents seek to make sense of those failures before, or those missteps, before their failure is foreordained, they have every incentive to shy away from a deep critique of the underlying narrative and to focus rather on a critique from within the terrain of the narrative itself. And let me give you an example from the very recent past that I think will make this highly concrete. You will all remember, or maybe have read about if you're younger, the ways in which by 2004, 2005, it was clear that the Iraq War was not going well, that the Bush administration's predictions that Saddam Hussein's government would be quickly overthrown were borne out, but that it had been replaced very quickly by an insurgency. And that the idea that in fact Iraqis would welcome the invading American forces with rose petals flying from their apartments in the cities had not come to pass. But that even worse, that not only had the Iraqi army melted away, but the entire Iraqi government structure had melted away, so that there was no one left to maintain order, and then the Bush administration's policy of de-Baathification, of removing all of the elements of the Ba'ath Party, had in turn removed all those who were competent administrators. So the United States, and its coalition of the willing, found itself faced with a festering insurgency. The response of the Democratic Party was not to say that Iraq was, in fact, showed that there was something deeply wrong with the underlying terror narrative into which it had been bound, but that in fact they began to say, and this was really that in fact they said the Iraq War was simply not being fought correctly. The Bush administration had gone in with too few boots on the ground. That was the dominant claim made by Democratic candidates in 2004. By the time we get to 2008, the Democratic candidates for president are not arguing that any longer. By then, the Iraq War is a dead letter. But again, they're not arguing that the Iraq War, that there was a deep flaw with the underlying narrative, the terror narrative into which had been bound to the war on terror. Rather, they argued it was the wrong war on terror. Most striking is that if of all the Democratic candidates for president in 2008, the one who had most made opposition to Iraq War, the deepest part of his political persona, was, of course, Barack Obama. He was the only one who had not been a major political figure in 2003. And so, of course, he didn't have a vote in the Senate like Hillary Clinton to run away from, in which she had, in fact, voted for, effectively, the Iraq War. So Barack Obama himself said it was the wrong war on terror. And what was the right war on terror? AfPak, Afghanistan and Pakistan. This is a critique from within the dominant narrative. And it was a much safer thing for Democrats to say. The Iraq War wasn't itself, initially the Iraq War wasn't deeply flawed, it was simply fought poorly. Or the Iraq War was the wrong war, but there was nothing wrong with the war on terror. We're big believers, they were saying, in the terror narrative. Don't think we're not tough guys when it comes to terror. When, of course, and this allowed them to say, we're tough on terror in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And so this was a critique from within the dominant terror narrative. And in fact, one of the parts of the book that I think is most original was that I have conducted the first systematic analysis of the Cold War consensus. And what my research shows is that the usual narrative of the Cold War consensus, which fits with the usual story we tell of major policy failures undoing dominant narratives, is wrong. That the Cold War consensus did not collapse in the crucible of Vietnam. If anything, the Vietnam led to the emergence of a new consensus about America's role in the world. The Cold War consensus actually collapsed in the wake of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was widely understood at the time as a triumph for the Kennedy administration, for the liberal internationalists, which allowed them, for the liberal Cold Warriors, which allowed them, ironically, to break from the dominant Cold War narrative and to articulate something in public that they had long spoken of behind closed doors, which was that the world was not a zero-sum world, not a world necessarily any longer of American gain and Soviet loss and Soviet gain and American loss, but rather a world in which the United States and the Soviet Union had common interests in avoiding nuclear Armageddon. Most recently, you might have seen just a couple weeks ago, Barack Obama spoke at American University in a conscious echo of a famous June 1963 John F. Kennedy commencement address at American University. That commencement address of John F. Kennedy's was striking for its ambition, much more ambitious than Barack Obama's argument for a particular deal with a particular adversary. John F. Kennedy in June 1963, 8 months after the termination of the Cuban Missile Crisis, John F. Kennedy argued for a fundamental rethinking of the Cold War. He publicly broke from the dominant Cold War narrative that had dominated American political debate since, in my account, since the early 1950s. And that took place not because of a massive policy failure, but because of a policy success, a large policy success, that allowed John F. Kennedy to say that the world has changed because we have been so successful. Barack Obama hasn't had that kind of triumph. He's waiting for that triumph. And the result is that he has found it difficult to break in a wholehearted way from the dominant national security narratives with which he came into office.
Whom is a narrative for? I mean, I can imagine in the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a public understanding of what happened. And there were those folks around a table very much like the one we're sitting at, who knew in their bones that we came very, very close to disaster. Now, in a certain way, what are your thoughts on whom a narrative needs to convince in order to become established?
I think of narratives as dominant public scripts, conventions of legitimate politics. What it is that responsible political actors say. And that's what makes it so hard to break from dominant narratives. They're ultimately enforced by a public, which expects its leaders to behave responsibly and legitimately. But dominant narratives themselves, I think that we often have a rather simplistic conception in the United States about how democracy operates. And our simplistic conception is rooted in that brilliant, wonderful, foundational, inspiring line of Abraham Lincoln's. The democracy of government of the people, by the people, and for the people. But sadly, what we know thanks to modern social science is that democracy is nothing of the sort. In that, in fact, most people, most of the time, are utterly ignorant of politics, that they are not motivated to learn anything about politics, that they aren't paying any attention to politics, that if public opinion moves reasonably, rationally in response to events, which it does, it's because it's deeply mediated by elite interventions. Basically, if you, someone who trusts Rush Limbaugh, you know what to think about politics because you listen to Rush Limbaugh. You don't follow politics really closely, but you listen to Rush. Or alternatively, you listen to somebody on the left. You listen to your senator, you listen to Al Franken, and he tells you, they provide cues as to what it is that their devotees should think about politics. And then you shift your views in response. You haven't gone and explored all sides of things. In fact, recent research has shown quite remarkably that news junkies, people who are obsessed with politics, actually are political omnivores. They are not the ones who are listening only to Fox News or reading only MSNBC or reading only the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. that they are in fact much more likely to read all sides of debates, not because they're truly open-minded, because their minds are largely made up, but rather because they want to know what the enemy thinks. The people who are most ignorant, who are least motivated, the people who are most interested in watching reality TV, if they follow politics at all, they do so only via these elite cues. Narrative competition is a competition among elites. And they have it's a deeply strategic game, which, as I implied in the story I told about why it is that it's so difficult for opponents to break from those dominant narratives amidst a military campaign. Ultimately, the judge is the mass public, but that mass public's views of what to think about alternative narratives themselves are mediated by elite responses. So this is very much, at its core, a game of elite rhetorical competition. And we shouldn't think that there's sort of an unmediated mass public sitting in judgment of these narratives that are being put forward, that they decide either do or don't accord with reality as they understand it. Everything we know about mass politics in the United States, and increasingly what we've come to know around the world as similar studies are being done everywhere, tell us that that is not the case. The US body politic may be somewhat unusual in its level of political disengagement, but it's not unique by any stretch.
Well, then, does your research focus on elites?
This is a story, very much a story, as I said, a story about elites. Right?
So how does
the
one...
kinds of rhetorical deployments they make, and that kind of rhetorical competition.
How does one do that? I mean, there are the public speeches, which presumably the the elite people listen to, and then there are all of these discussions to which only quite limited numbers of folks are privy. Where does what's your plan of research for studying, say, how an alternative to the dominant view gets established or supplants the dominant view or modifies it, given that you're working not solely with public rhetoric, but also with the rhetoric that occurs in all of these odd places to which cameras generally aren't admitted?
Actually, I want to correct a misimpression. What I'm largely interested in here are public narratives, but it's elite competition. And of course, it's not just a bunch of folks sitting around this table and in this small seminar room, right? When we're dealing with elites, we're still dealing here with a large group of the attentive public. That's still only a very small minority of the American public, but it's not just folks around this table. When the Chicago Council, what used to be known as the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations, conducts their survey of American foreign policy elites, they're not just dealing with elected politicians. That's part of it, of course. But there's a much broader set of the punditocracy and business elites and elected politicians and academics who participate in these kinds of public debates, writing in the old days in forums that got a lot of attention, like Foreign Affairs, and speaking on, This Week with David Brinkley. Today, of course, it's a somewhat different context. Today, in the world of the blogosphere, of course, everybody can find a forum. The only question is, can you get anybody to pay attention? Right? So everything's out there for everybody to see. The question is, what's going to actually take off and what are people paying attention to? So these are debates that are being held in public. I'm very much interested in those public narratives. What I am interested in, and what gets the really challenging part, is trying to understand, if you, as George W. Bush used to call the strategery, right? That is the strategic element of this kind of elite competition. Half the time I don't know what's going on between my ears. As an outside analyst, it's really hard for me to say, why did person X do this, or say this, or not say this? our historical accounts are always, we're telling narratives, right? And it's impossible to tell a narrative that is meaningful to people without motive, right? If we just told a story about 9/11, about these folks that, flew there, which is what George W. Bush initially did, about simply these terrorists flying their planes into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, that doesn't really make meaning for people. What makes meaning is when you provide reasons. Because while philosophers debate whether reasons are causes, we, everyday human beings, not up in that rarefied era of philosophy, we have no doubt that reasons are causes, that people do what they do because of their motivations. And so though it's really hard, we tell stories about motivations, but it's really hard to pin down those motivations. And so at the end of the day, of course, we do the best we can, but we're ultimately telling a kind of plausible story that makes the best sense that we can out of the available evidence of the kinds of calculations that are going into their rhetorical choices. And what leads them to continue to hew to particular dominant narratives, or to be willing to and capable of breaking with those dominant narratives. We do have some clues. So for instance, I gave the example earlier of John F. Kennedy's 1963 commencement address at American University. That was such a radical break from the Cold War. So we know from past speeches that Kennedy's chief speechwriter, Theodore Sorensen, that he had in fact many paragraphs and phrases in that speech came from previous drafts of old speeches that Kennedy and his aides had stricken from his inaugural address, from his speech to the UN General Assembly in 1961 and 62, that were thought at the time to simply be too radical. Sorensen in June 63 clearly got the lesson from Kennedy, clearly was told by Kennedy, it's okay to put those in now. And so of course you can then ask yourself, well, why was it okay to put them in now? And then it becomes quite reasonable to think about the fact that even the Chicago Tribune, classic Republican newspaper, no fan of the callow, young, immature president, as they used to call him, that they too had no choice, they felt, but to give him a tremendous amount of credit for what had transpired in the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962. Kennedy's political position had shifted, and so by tracing the legacy of these different speeches and what struck and what is retained and what is then reintroduced at another time, we can get a fair amount of insight, even though we don't have actual transcripts of the meetings between Sorensen and Kennedy and other speechwriters. We can get a reasonably good sense about how they understood that the political context had shifted at that time. So elites, of course, are crucial, but that elite audience, what is sometimes called actually in theory, in theory people have started to speak no longer of an electorate, but of a selectorate. That is to say that although the mass of Americans have the vote in a democracy, that in fact regimes are much more like each other than not, in that we can compare them by looking at the size and scope of the selectorate, that those that are meaningfully engaged in politics and are actually deciding whether leaders are returned to office. Yes, in the Soviet Union of Brezhnev's time in the 1970s, that selectorate was smaller than in the United States. But this was not the regime of Stalin, where it was just Stalin. By the time we get to Brezhnev, the Soviet selectorate has grown, and of course the American selectorate isn't nearly as large as the mass public. It's in fact a much smaller group that is attentive to politics.
What you're telling me, if I get you right, though, is that tracking the natural sources, public speeches, opinion pieces in the major newspapers, articles in foreign affairs, that range of resources will give one the information one needs to think about changes in thinking among the people who count.
It tells us about changes in the public conventions to which they feel obligated to adhere. Mm-hmm. That's what I mean by a dominant narrative. We know for example, from folks like Les Gelb, who was one of the foreign service officers who quit the Foreign Service over Vietnam. We know from Les Gelb that there was lots and lots of questioning of the Cold War consensus within the belly of the government beast in the early 1960s. By the Cold War consensus, I mean a variety of axioms about the fact that the Soviet Union was irredeemably aggressive, that the communist world was monolithic, right? But of course, you couldn't really give voice to these things for many years, publicly. The breakdown of the gap between people's private thinking and their public thinking, what legitimate, responsible figures could publicly say without being assailed, not merely as being wrong on policy grounds, cost-benefit grounds, but being wrong in a sort of a deep way that they were uttering something utterly illegitimate. That's the difference that I'm talking about. So, let me give another example that I think will make this concrete, right? If you were a U.S. government decision maker for many, many years, they would privately understood that there was a major split within in the communist world between China and the Soviet Union. That you understood, many experts understood, that Ho Chi Minh did not take orders from Peking, as they used to call it in those days, from the People's Republic of China. And yet, that was how official narrative narrated the Vietnam War. Even though Secretary of State Dean Rusk absolutely knew better, and finally, under questioning, finally broke with that in 1966 in the famous Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearings. So it doesn't give you an insight into thinking. It gives you an insight into the dominant scripts to which responsible members of the policy-making community feel compelled to adhere. That's what I mean by a dominant narrative. And the contention that underlies all my work, and what I trace when I explore how it shapes policy, is the notion of legitimation. If policy doesn't have to be legitimated, that is, publicly justified, then these dominant narratives don't matter very much. The reason dominant narratives matter is because policy must be when policy must be legitimated. And that which cannot be legitimated in those circumstances cannot be pursued. Of course, you will say, governments pursue covert actions, right? They go and they overthrow Allende. Plausible deniability via the CIA. And they do this, they engage in covert action precisely because these are acts that cannot be legitimated. And yet, of course, what happens when these covert actions are brought to light? Then their legitimation is at stake, right? And they are deemed illegitimate and incapable of justification. So it is, in fact, legitimation, the imperative to legitimation, is what drives policy to the shadows. And often, of course, and that's where this is, it is the policy that is made in the shadows, through covert action, or in the deep byways of bureaucracy. That, of course, itself quietly tells us about the power of legitimation. Why, when Ronald Reagan was not making headway with the American public and the Congress over the funding of the Contras, when he couldn't dominate those debates over the Contras were all good and the Sandinistas were all evil, and as a famous staffer puts in a famous line, putting the white hats on the Contras and the black hats on the Sandinistas, Reagan ultimately turns to fund them via covert means, right? This underlies the Iran-Contra scandal that almost undoes his presidency.
You've spoken a bunch about the basic theoretical and research orientation of your work. Where's the growing edge? How are you thinking in your most recent publication?
So, this, as I mentioned, this is part of a forthcoming book, and where I'm going with this is really one extension of this. Of course, remember I mentioned that my work always begins out of concern with the politics of the present, and everything that I've done, I've tried at one time or another to speak to audiences like this one, and also national audiences. This concern with narrative has led me to, thanks in fact to an event that I did at the Institute for Advanced Study last year. It has led me to reflect quite a bit about our national obsession with strategizing. Now, we have a big literature on strategy, right? And that literature, strategy, of course, is the stock and trade of what people like me do. We debate various different strategic options for the United States. I talk about strategy all the time. I engage in those debates about what kind of strategy the United States should pursue in the world. But we have a lot of research that shows us that basically all of this is a bunch of hooey. Why? Because ultimately, governments are incapable of following strategy consistently. They are incapable of being held to those strategies. And we probably wouldn't want them to be held to those strategies even if they could, because that would lead them to behave in kind of they've got a hammer and all the world is their nail. And of course, different events manifest themselves in different ways and require different policies that are deeply sensitive to the particular circumstances. So, in fact, policymaking is a deeply contextual kind of enterprise. And yet we have this national obsession with strategizing. Every few years, every couple of years, the administration is compelled to put out by law its national security strategy. And even before the president was required to do so in the mid-1980s, the president periodically gave voice to that national security strategy because people want to know what the strategy is. And by law, now every arm of the US government that deals with national security down the chain puts out a series of documents, operational documents, tactical documents that fit into that strategizing. So, of course, narrative is part of, if you will, strategizing is part and parcel of our obsession with publicly making sense of things. And we have now enshrined this in law. And ultimately, I asked in a piece co-authored with David Edelstein of Georgetown University, an old friend of mine, is this a good thing or a bad thing? And we run through all of the possible reasons that you might think that strategizing, requiring public engagement with strategy is a good thing. Maybe you might think it generates better policy. That's the whole idea of the liberal marketplace of ideas, that ultimately the worst ideas get struck down. Maybe it creates a set of standards to which we will ultimately hold our elected leaders accountable. And ultimately what Dave Edelstein and I conclude is not only is that all of these things that are the supposed benefits of strategy do not hold, strategizing, I should say, the public engagement, don't hold. But B, in fact, strategizing is deeply counterproductive. Because it makes us think, it deludes us into thinking that we are in fact engaged in a serious conversation about strategy, when we are not. It makes us think that we've done our due diligence, when we haven't. And it makes us think that we have a set of standards to which our leaders will be held accountable, when they won't. And not only that, it leads us to be in search of dragons to slay. That there are good bureaucratic and psychological reasons that in the course of the strategizing enterprise, we find ourselves constructing national security narratives and producing dominant national security narratives, especially for a country like the United States that is so immensely powerful and has such an immensely powerful military, that leads us always to look for those dragons that our knight-errant can go and slay. And that has gotten us in an awful lot of trouble. And so that not only is strategizing is not only not a boon, but it's also not costless. And that it has been deeply counterproductive and that we've closed with sort of what I would call 3 cheers for pragmatism, which is in some sense intellectually might feel to us unsatisfying because we want to engage in rational decision-making that is deeply strategic and so on. But that in fact, a more pragmatic perspective would allow for a greater multiplicity of narratives, a more open political debate, and ultimately better policymaking.
So if I'm understanding right, in this foreign affairs piece, your aim is to recommend to policymakers a shift in the way they think about what they're doing and a shift in the way they construct kind of their legitimating narrative.
I wouldn't say it's just to policymakers. This is for all of us. We demand this of our policymakers. This is to satisfy that public demand for meaning making, which in some ways is inevitable. And what we're trying to do is to get people to shift away from the search for the silver bullets of doctrine and to get away from the strategizing enterprise that, in our view, contributes to that and has contributed to an American body politic that seems to be incapable of restraint. And ultimately, that, and to move us toward a more pragmatic model of policy, a discourse.
Thank you.